Hello, and thanks for joining me. Today I'd like to give a general overview of carbon markets. And this video is going to be different than some of my other ones because it's going to be more of a lecture. What I want to try to do today in this video is describe what carbon markets are, where carbon credits come from, how carbon projects work, what to look out for in terms of good projects and bad projects, and then talk about some of the recent scandals and trends in the carbon markets. So to start off, one of the important things that I want to talk about is myself. My name's Elias Airy. I have a PhD in forest science. My specialty is actually in remote sensing. I've been in the carbon markets for the last 5 years. My first entry into the carbon markets was as a scientist at a carbon broker called Pachama. And what we would do at Pachama is basically buy and resell credits. And my major role there at Pachama was to evaluate carbon projects to assess their quality. And we would use satellite imagery, among other things, to determine whether or not the carbon offsets that we were trading were legitimate. And I think Pachama is happy to share publicly these days that most of the carbon projects that we evaluated, we rejected. Our rejection rate was well over 50%. We were rejecting carbon projects because they didn't really have the quality that we were looking for, and it didn't seem as if they were actually offsetting the CO2 that they said they were. I left Pachama in late 2021, and the reason I left is because I wanted to have a greater impact on the space, and I wanted to kind of share the findings that I was, coming across in my survey of carbon projects across, different project types. So after leaving Pachama, I co-founded a carbon ratings agency called Renoster, and I'm currently Chief Science Officer there. And what Renoster does is we evaluate carbon projects, primarily nature-based carbon projects, and we see whether or not those carbon projects are actually removing the CO2 that they say that they are, as well as, whether or not they're just and equitable. We essentially cater to people who are buying credits or people who are investing in credits, and we act as an extra check to make sure that everything is right. I think the last thing that you have to know about me before we start is that, I have emerged as something of an industry critic in this space. I didn't mean for it to be that way, but I have been very outspoken when I see, what seems to me as being carbon credits that aren't necessarily valid. So my reputation is a little bit of maybe a naysayer, but I can assure you that I do strongly believe in the carbon markets. So let's start the actual presentation here. What are carbon markets? Well, there are 3 different types of carbon markets from my perspective, although other people might break it up into different categories. On the one hand, we have compliance markets, and these are basically markets that are enforced by legal standards across the globe. There's quite a few of them. There's a handful of them in the United States, implemented by different states like Washington and California. Canadian provinces have their own carbon markets. European Union has its own carbon markets. Many times these are called ETSs, or emissions trading systems. The way that most of these work are basically cap and trade systems. So emitters, like maybe a coal power plant, are told by the government, this is how much carbon you can emit. If you want to emit more, you have to buy credits from someone else. And if you emit less, then you can sell those credits on the ETS market. You can also use offsets to kind of deal with some of those emissions. So if you're a coal power plant in, let's say California or something, you're allowed to use about 4% of carbon offset sourced from forestry or other sources to make up for your emissions. There are a number of these ETS marketplaces. I would say in North America, the California Air Resource Board is kind of the largest one. Many states use the protocol set out by the California Air Resource Board, so it can be a little confusing in the terminology there. The European Union has an ETS. New Zealand, Australia, China has an ETS, but it's very nascent. India is setting one up right now. And the size of the compliance market is quite large. It's something like $850 billion in carbon trades that have taken place on these compliance markets. Now, the thing to note about these compliance markets is that, you know, the carbon is kind of arbitrary. It's carbon that's been kind of decided by the society or by the government as being okay to emit. So 850 billion is a lot of money, but it's kind of funny money. It's not as if people are removing $850 billion worth of CO2 from the atmosphere. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the voluntary markets. And these are markets that allow corporations and individuals to buy carbon offsets in order to offset their own emissions. So a big company like Microsoft or, Google, for example, they have a lot of emissions that are the result of their company's operations. They can't reduce those emissions and still remain in business. And so what they do is they buy offsets to make up for the fact that they still have to pollute a little bit. Even I myself buy carbon offsets to offset my own pollution. I travel all around the world for my job. I go to all these conferences. I have a fairly large carbon footprint, and so I buy carbon offsets to deal with that. This market is largely self-regulated, so there aren't too many. There aren't any governments that are really sticking their nose into these things and making sure that the rules are followed. This voluntary market appeals to kind of a growing cohort of corporations. And it's, these corporations are basically trying to exceed the standards. They're trying to do better than what they have to do under government regulations. And they have a variety of reasons to do that, whether it's corporate ethos or, just pure PR for people who are buying, their products and want to know that they're buying a green, product. The size of the voluntary market is quite small. It's only $2 billion worldwide. So it gets a lot of attention. A lot of the controversies that have come out have been about the voluntary carbon markets, but it's actually a very small amount of carbon that we're talking about at the end of the day. In between these two systems that we see on the marketplace, we kind of have these quasi-compliance markets that also have kind of popped up. And these are kind of markets that are kind of put in place by pressures, be it social pressures or corporate pressures, to kind of quasi-force companies that are involved to do something about their emissions. One good example is the Colombian carbon tax. If you're emitting carbon in Colombia, you either have to pay a tax or you can buy carbon offsets to do something about your emissions. You're not required to buy carbon offsets, but you're kind of pressured to do so. Another good example is an organization called CORSIA, and CORSIA is an airline industry standard. Now, it would be, no airline is forced to buy carbon offsets, through CORSIA, but I think that because all major airlines are part of CORSIA and part of the larger airline framework that CORSIA is a part of, it would be very difficult to be operating as a large airline and not buy, credits through CORSIA. So these kind of quasi-compliance systems have also kind of emerged. In addition to those three categories, I think there's another two categories that kind of exist worldwide. One of them is the Paris Climate Accord. So Article 6 of the Paris Climate Accord allowed nations to issue their own carbon credits. And so entire countries can now sign up and enroll for carbon offsets. And by pledging to reduce their deforestation, they're then able to sell carbon offsets to other nations or even to companies if they want. This market is very new. It came about after the Paris Climate Accord, but it's really only been put in place very recently, and only 2 nations that I know of are currently enrolled to actually receive credits. The methodologies behind this are very vague, so it can be quite confusing to navigate. Finally, we have bilateral agreements, and so this is basically just referring to when one country pays another country to reduce their emissions and avoid deforestation. So the best example that I know of is Norway. Norway has paid Brazil and Indonesia to reduce their own deforestation rates, and they kind of use that to say that Norway's own emissions through oil are kind of offset by this good work that they're doing in Brazil and Indonesia. Bilateral agreements are kind of being phased out in favor of Article 6 agreements. If you're looking at this, you're probably mostly interested in the voluntary carbon market, I would assume. I guess it's worth pointing out, as a carbon ratings expert, that all of these marketplaces oftentimes have the similar types of carbon projects. So they have projects that are, forestry. They have projects that are, direct air capture, etc. And the reliability of carbon projects under all of these approaches is about equal. That said, compliance credits typically sell for a lot more than voluntary credits. And last that I looked, compliance credits sell for about $15 a ton because there's kind of a natural inbuilt demand created by laws, and voluntary credits sell for about $4 a ton. So what are carbon credits? Where do they come from? Well, carbon credits are sourced from carbon projects, and carbon projects are a variety of techniques that humans have developed to basically pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere or keep carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, fundamentally, there are two different types of carbon offsets. There's carbon removals, in which carbon dioxide is actively being pulled out of the atmosphere, and then there's avoided emissions, where we can say carbon dioxide was absolutely going to be emitted into the atmosphere, and we can take some sort of action to prevent that from occurring. Now, conceptually and mathematically, both of these should be equal. In both situations, if the carbon project doesn't exist, then by year's end, there's an extra ton of carbon in the atmosphere. But a lot of people make the distinction between removals and avoided emissions, and a lot of people favor removals above avoided emissions, particularly because they think that they're kind of stronger project types. So how do we get carbon out of the atmosphere? Well, primarily we use trees. As you can see here by this big pie chart, which is a little out of date, 50% of carbon credits issued today are from forestry projects. And so you can do this either by planting trees, which as they grow remove carbon from the atmosphere because wood is primarily made of carbon, or by preventing trees from being cut down, because trees being cut down is a large source of carbon that goes into the atmosphere and contributes to climate change. Actually, this is a little out of date. I think that trees now represent something like 60% of the carbon market. On this graph, at least, another quarter of carbon credits come from renewable energy credits. These are called RECs for short. And the idea behind this is if you're basically putting up a wind turbine, building a hydropower dam, putting up a solar farm, you can receive carbon credits for the good work that you're doing because presumably that is reducing our need for fossil fuels for electricity. Other carbon projects are a little bit more niche. You can see the last quarter on this pie chart. Landfill methane removal is a fairly large one. So landfills constantly give off methane gas into the atmosphere, and this is actually quite a lot of damage that it does to the environment. And by capturing that methane gas, we can basically issue carbon credits for avoided emissions. Other ones, there's cook stove projects that are handing out more efficient stove types to people. There are methane capture devices for agricultural products, but we're getting increasingly niche and getting closer and closer to 1 to 2% of the market as we get further down this wedge here. So most carbon credits, I think it's fair to say, come from trees. The other big question that you may have is, where do carbon credits come from in terms of who's actually making these things? Well, carbon credits are sourced from registry organizations. Registries are usually these nonprofit organizations that create a set of rules. There are a set of protocols that you can follow in order to get carbon credits. So there are 4 big registries out there and a bunch of little ones that are trying to compete. And these registries create rules for planting trees, rules for taking carbon from landfills, etc. And these registry organizations, nobody necessarily appointed them. They kind of cropped up in the marketplace on their own. So they're not necessarily government organizations, although in the compliance markets, the registries have to follow the government's set of rules. It gets very complicated. One thing to note here is that most carbon credits, as you can see, is sourced from one source, which is on this chart called VCS. VCS is the registry standard that is run by an organization called Verra. And Verra currently controls about 69% of the market. In terms of nature-based voluntary carbon offsets, Verra controls a much larger share. And in fact, outside the United States, in terms of nature-based voluntary carbon offsets, Verra controls more than 95% of the market. So in a very real way, Verra is a little bit of a monopoly in this market right now. I guess it's kind of similar to how internet companies work in the United States. There are multiple internet companies, sure, but me, myself, living in Washington, I can only get internet from Comcast, and so it's a bit of a monopoly for me. Likewise, a Brazilian looking to protect their rainforest can only get carbon credits from Verra, and therefore that's a bit of a monopoly. This will come up again because it's caused problems if we have a marketplace that doesn't have proper competition. So, let's talk about trees. Well, like I said, like 60% of carbon credits on the market today are sourced from trees, and I am a forest scientist, so obviously I'm biased towards trees, but it's an important thing to understand. Wood itself is almost entirely comprised of carbon and hydrogen. About half of a wood's weight is made up of carbon molecules, and if you were to convert those carbon molecules to CO2 equivalents, more than the weight of the tree would be, is basically being stored in the wood of the tree. Tropical rainforests themselves store about, oftentimes 500 tons or more of carbon dioxide per hectare. So there's a lot of carbon dioxide that's stored in a hectare of forest. The Amazon rainforest alone is 526 million hectares. So if you start multiplying those numbers, you can see that forests are storing a massive amount of carbon. Gigatons and gigatons of carbon dioxide. A young and growing forest can remove about 25 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And the long-term average for a forest that's been planted in a fairly productive environment is about 7 to 10 tons per hectare per year, which is a safe global average if we're going to be making averages of how much forests can remove. So this adds up to quite a lot of carbon. It adds up to sizable amounts of how much carbon human beings have put into the atmosphere. One of the things that's nice about trees is that anybody can plant a tree and anybody can basically protect a forest. Forests are accessible and they're ideally equitable for pretty much anyone. And so this is a situation in which anybody, whether or not they're living in a developed nation or a developing nation, can pitch in to help deal with climate change. Right now, deforestation represents a very large portion of human emissions. So humans are going around and cutting down forests, and we're either burning that or we're putting that carbon into the atmosphere by getting rid of that wood. And that represents about 11% of the emissions that are going into the atmosphere today from human sources. So forests alone, whether or not we talk about carbon offsets, are already a key player in climate change. On the other hand, forest growth across the entire world absorbs about 30% of the CO2 that humans emit annually. So even before we start talking about offsetting schemes and about whether or not we could reforest the earth, the forests that we have today are already taking out massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. And they're doing so just purely based on their natural growth. We see a lot of arguments against trees these days, and I think that we have to defend the concept a little bit before we talk about carbon offsets. One thing that people will often argue trees are not good for is permanence. So people will say that forests, they're not a long-term storage of carbon because trees die or trees can burn down. Well, this is a little bit of a misnomer. The first reason that this is a misnomer is that yes, trees do die, but forests in general are a steady state system long term. So yes, a tree will grow up, it'll grow old, it'll die. If you're planting trees, maybe 80 years from now, those trees are going to die. But what you're really doing is you're reforesting an area. And so when trees grow up and they grow old and they die, they're replaced by new trees. And so over the long term, if you look at a forest, it's actually sequestering maybe a little bit of carbon, but at the very least, it's at a level baseline. It's at a level point where it's storing a lot of carbon. And for the proof of that, all we have to do is look at the Amazon rainforest. Trees are permanent because the Amazon rainforest has been storing at least 123 billion tons of carbon dioxide for the last 55 million years. And so, this concept that like trees aren't necessarily like a long-term solution, that has more to do with human beings than it does with trees. Next, I want to talk about fires. Forest fires are certainly a risk, although to some extent this risk is a little bit overplayed. There are many forests on Earth. In fact, I think it's safe to say the majority of forests on Earth have no fire risk whatsoever. More importantly, though, fires are a natural part of forest regeneration. So when you see a dramatic picture of like a forest going up in flames, to some extent, that is a natural part of the forest cycle. And so if you are protecting a large area of forest, some of that area may burn, but then some of that other area is going to be growing back. And so naturally, this cycle kind of levels out and creates a steady state system. Well, at least it would create a steady state system if human beings weren't around. And this is the important note, which is that climate change is exacerbating many fires, and many forests are at greater risk of fire than they were historically. And so there are these kind of marginal forests that exist out there that are at great risk of burning down, primarily because of climate change or because of mismanagement. So we have to acknowledge that there probably are some forest types that are not ideally suited for carbon offset projects. I would argue, living in Washington, that maybe forests in eastern Washington are not ideally suited for carbon offset projects. But that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to admit. The other thing that's important about forests is that, the durability and the permanence of forests, it relies on human beings. Human beings are often the ones who are starting the fires. Human beings are often the ones who are cutting down the trees. So the Amazon rainforest has been there for longer than most coal deposits, 55 million years at least. But human beings are the ones who are at risk of cutting it down. So when people say that forests aren't permanent, what they really often mean is that we can't necessarily trust a human being not to cut the trees down, which is, a fairly good point. The other argument that I often see is that trees are not enough. And I get very annoyed by this. So Bill Gates, for example, recently came out there and said that, trees aren't going to get us out of climate change. Well, he's right. Trees are not going to get us out of climate change. If we replanted the entire world with forests, if we took all the reforestable land and planted it with trees, we'd probably still only store about 205 billion tons of CO2, which is about half of, the emissions that humans have put in the atmosphere since 1850. So we've only gotten ourselves out of half of the climate change damage we've done today. That equates to about 6 years of human emissions at this rate. I think that we are currently at something like 33 billion tons per year right now. So that doesn't look so great for forests, right? Well, there are ways in which we can kind of imagine forests removing more CO2 than what these numbers say. If we were to manage forests specifically to remove carbon, for example. But I think the bigger point is that this really doesn't matter, because when you plant a tree, you can be absolutely certain that when that tree grows, it is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so whether or not forests at large can do away with climate change is completely irrelevant as to whether or not we should be supporting forests as a way of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And here's the thing directly for Bill Gates here. A lot of people these days are pointing towards engineered solutions for getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And I think I'm covering up the picture here, but there's a picture of a gigantic CO2 capture facility sitting in the desert where giant fans are removing CO2 from the atmosphere. This is called direct air capture. And a lot of Silicon Valley engineers think that this is the solution to climate change. We're going to put up these gigantic factories everywhere, and for every ton of CO2 we put into the atmosphere, we're going to take it right back out. Well, I have to tell you, the thermodynamics behind that are pretty grim. These facilities, they're not very efficient. The most efficient ones today are only about 10% efficient. And it takes an enormous amount of energy to actually remove that CO2 from the atmosphere. You have to heat up basically a filter medium to a very high temperature. And so, one study showed recently that if we were to meet our 2021 climate goals for 2 degrees C and keep on the track that we're at right now, we would have to devote 40% of the entire world's electricity supply to direct air capture by 2035. I think that's fairly unrealistic. I think it's fair to say that forests are not going to solve climate change, and it's also fair to say that direct air capture devices are not going to solve climate change either. All solutions are needed at once. If we're going to solve climate change, it's going to be doing a little bit of this, it's going to be doing a little bit of that, and it's going to be reducing our emissions. The math behind climate change is pretty grim, no matter how you look at it. So, let's talk about forest carbon projects. They are the most common type. They're my specialty. And, this is where a lot of the scandals are that you've heard about, I'm sure. There are 3 different types of forest carbon projects out there today. There's avoided emissions projects that are often called REDD+ projects. And these are based around avoiding deforestation. So the idea is that if you can prove for absolute certain that a tree was going to be cut down, this year, and you can protect that tree, then you're taking CO2 that would have gone into the atmosphere and you're making sure that it stays intact and stays out of the atmosphere, and you can get a credit for that. This represents a majority of forest carbon credits, as I think it should, because it's always going to be easier to protect a tree that already exists than it is to bring back a forest from scratch. The problem here is that it requires some very tricky estimates of what would have happened to the forest if the project didn't exist. So you have to be able to say, if not for this project, then this tree was really going to be cut down. And that's a very difficult hypothetical for most people. The next type of carbon project that we have is reforestation. So this is the idea of planting trees. Reforestation is a purely removal type of carbon project. So as the trees grow, they are removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Trees can still be harvested for timber, and in fact, the vast majority of reforestation projects today on the marketplace are timber production projects. But you can see here how the curve kind of works. If you start from nothing, then you can grow a bunch of trees and cut a bunch of them down and grow them again and cut a bunch of them down. And over the long term, you've still removed a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The last type of forest project that we have is called improved forest management. And the idea here is that we can take degraded, middle-aged forests and let them grow back. We can say, these forests, they've been really badly managed in the past. They're likely going to be continued to be badly managed. And if we just let them grow a little bit more, then we can not only remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but we can prevent it from going into the atmosphere. And so improved forest management projects, they're actually a combination of both removal and avoided emissions. Now, improved forest management is most common in the US, Canada, and Mexico, because that's kind of where the rule sets exist to be doing this kind of stuff. So how do we actually, what are the fundamental elements of carbon projects? There are 7 pillars to carbon projects, and I would say 5 of them are applicable to any type of carbon project that you have, today. So I'm going to be mostly talking about this in the context of trees, but it's applicable to everything that you're doing. If you're getting carbon credits, we have to make sure that all of these pillars have kind of been followed. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this concept called additionality. And that's just a fancy word for saying that, is the project justified in existing at all? Were the trees really at risk if you're protecting trees that were going to be cut down? Would the trees have been planted anyway? Would the solar farm have been built no matter what? The problem is that there's a lot of people doing things that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but carbon credits should really only be issued if the actual value, the actual money from the carbon credit is being used to, create some sort of action that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so we don't want to be sponsoring, projects that are basically timber companies that were always planting trees anyway, because that carbon was always going to be removed. If you're actually going to offset pollution that has really been put into the atmosphere, then that offset needs to be a real drawdown that wouldn't have happened otherwise. The next concept that I want to introduce is called the baseline. So the baseline is basically measuring what would have happened if the project didn't exist. So, how many of these trees would have been cut down? Is it 30%? Is it 90%? How much of these solar panels would have been installed? Let's examine the idea of a solar farm, for example. Maybe without the incentive of carbon offsets, maybe only 1/10 of the solar panels would have been put in place. With carbon offsets, 10 times the number of solar panels are able to be put in place thanks to this influx of money. Well, if that's the case, then we shouldn't be issuing carbon offsets for every solar panel in that farm. We should only be issuing carbon offsets for 9 out of 10. The next big pillar of carbon crediting is verification. And what I'm saying here is basically how much carbon really is there. We need to be able to accurately measure how much carbon our project is actually removing or preventing from going into the atmosphere. How much carbon are the trees storing? How much carbon is the solar panel offsetting? How much carbon has the methane capture device managed to pull out of the landfill? Generally speaking, we can, but we have to make sure that the proper processes are followed in this approach. The next big pillar that I want to talk about of carbon offsetting is this concept called leakage. And fundamentally what we're asking here is, through the actions of this project, has carbon been emitted somewhere else? This may be the case if, for example, by preventing deforestation here, maybe the bad guys just went next door and cut down a tree somewhere else. If that's the case, then we shouldn't necessarily be getting carbon offsets for our work. Finally, we have permanence. So this is a concept of basically how long are we actually removing carbon from the atmosphere for? What's the risk of natural disasters? For how long is our project actually going to protect the trees? For how long are these solar panels actually going to be around? So these are the 5 core concepts that exist for all carbon offsetting. But there's some extra concepts that kind of exist more in the forest carbon space. And these are basically what are termed as co-benefits in the carbon markets. And there's fundamentally 2 different types of co-benefits that exist right now. There's ecological co-benefits. So if you are planting trees or if you're restoring some sort of ecosystem, what other benefits are you providing to the world by doing that? Is there water that's being filtered through the forest that's now drinkable to human beings? Are there endangered species that are being protected? Is there food or medicine that's potentially being protected by this forest? The other very important element of particularly forest carbon projects is the social element. What kind of social co-benefits are there? Fundamentally, what we're asking here is the money making it to the right place? Now, are the people inside this carbon project that have been told they have to stop cutting trees down actually getting paid a sufficient amount to make up for the fact that they've made a sacrifice? Are these, is there justifiable expenditures of money inside these areas? And, is there additional good being done by the project in terms of building schools or water treatment plants or healthcare facilities? Now, what I want to do next is go through step by step all of these criteria in excruciating detail. Because I think it's important, especially if you're buying offsets, for you to kind of understand what to look out for. So let's talk about additionality. Additionality is, like I said, it's just asking, is the project justified in existing in the first place? So does the project need to exist in order for carbon to have been removed from the atmosphere? Offsetting only works if the money has a direct linear path to carbon being removed from the atmosphere. So situations in which the carbon was already being removed, those should not be getting carbon credits. And so oftentimes people break additionality up into subcategories. One subcategory is called financial additionality. And what people are asking here is, if not for these offsets, would people have had the money to do this anyway? Would the money have already been there to plant trees or to, build solar panels? Legal additionality is another big question. And we're often asking here, are there laws in place that would have already mandated this action? So was the government forcing people to already protect their forest? If this is the case, then we should not be, issuing these forest carbon credits because, there's already an action in place to make sure these forests remain intact. Finally, we have the common practice. The idea behind this is, are other people on the landscape doing the same thing without the incentive of carbon credits? So we have to ask ourselves, is everyone else putting up solar panels anyway? And if they are, maybe we shouldn't be giving carbon credits to some guy who's putting up solar panels. We also have to ask ourselves, are other people planting these trees no matter what? So one big example of additionality gone wrong is from John Oliver. If you're a fan, he has a late night comedian talk show where he goes over like deep dive investigatory pieces. And what he did was he lambasted carbon offsets about a year or two ago, mostly because of their additionality. And what he was actually making fun of were a bunch of parks in the United States, like a bunch of preserves that had been around for decades, if not more than 100 years. And all of these parks were receiving carbon credits for preserving their trees. Now, these parks were always going to preserve their trees. Whether or not those carbon credits were issued, it was always going to happen. And yet, to get these credits, they had to say that their trees were at risk. So I want to step us through some good and bad examples that are common in a lot of project types in terms of additionality. So let's start with reforestation. Bad examples of carbon credits that are coming from, reforestation projects are when timber companies are planting really big non-native timber monocultures. So there are a lot of timber companies in the world today, and they make all of their money by planting trees, harvesting them after 10 to 15 years, and then replanting them again, and using that to, make paper or build houses or whatever it is. Carbon credits should never be issued to a timber company for doing what it was already going to do. Unfortunately, a lot of the reforestation credits on the market today are basically timber companies doing what they were always going to do, and a lot of the time they're these non-native, highly industrial plantations. So when I mean highly industrial, what I'm referring to are short rotations, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. These are farms. These are tree farms. And they should not get carbon credits for what they were always going to do. But what is additional reforestation? Well, native species reforestation is always great. Little or no timber harvesting is another really good sign that what you've got here wouldn't have otherwise happened. And communal planting efforts are also a really big plus. So if you've got all these elements, odds are your project never would have happened without the incentive of carbon credits because there's no commercial reason to be planting these trees. Let's talk about renewable energy credits. Bad examples of renewable energy credits are instances in which there's clear evidence of prior intent. Oftentimes these are state-sponsored projects where the money's already been lined up. There's already these external funding sources to, create these, renewable energy sources. So here's an example that I'm providing here of a Chinese hydropower dam that was built by the Chinese state government and is receiving carbon credits. Now, the Chinese state government was always going to build this hydropower dam. It should not be getting carbon credits for doing so. Good examples of renewable energy credits are instances in which there's direct pathways from the money from the carbon credits straight to the actual construction of the renewable energy devices. So if there's a very clear budgetary path in which, you absolutely would have needed this money in order to construct this solar farm, then that's a good example of an additional renewable energy credit. Avoided deforestation is, of course, a thorny issue, and I want to give some examples of good and bad there, too. Some bad examples, like I said, are when parks are already conserving their forests and are getting carbon credits as like a little cherry on top for their work. Another bad example is when carbon projects just enroll the areas in their, the little bits that are required by law that they maintain as a forest. So in this example, you can see these really squiggly patterns here. What this project developer has done is they've enrolled areas that they either were legally mandated to preserve or couldn't necessarily access with their harvester because it's super steep. And so, these credits, they're never needed to exist in order to preserve these trees because the trees were never really at risk to begin with. Good examples are, on the other hand, are cases in which you can really prove very easily that the area was at some sort of risk of harvesting or deforestation. So here are two very clear examples of projects on the edge of the Amazon rainforest. We can look at deforestation that's happened in the last, 10 to 15 years, and it's butting up right next to the project. And if it weren't for the project and the project's nice big fences, then, these areas undoubtedly would have been deforested. So some project types are just inherently more additional than others. And maybe that's not a fair way of saying it. Some project types are just inherently easier to prove additionality than others. And so some examples include direct air capture. So if you're building a gigantic factory in the middle of the desert that's pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, there's not much reason for anyone to be doing that if not for carbon credits. Methane capture, usually there's not much of a commercial reason to be taking methane off of landfills, although sometimes there is. Mangrove restoration. Every mangrove restoration project that I've looked at is fantastic because there's no situation when a timber company is ever going to restore a mangrove habitat. So, anytime somebody's planting mangrove trees, odds are they needed the money from the carbon credits to do that. Other project types include wood burial and biochar. So you can, for example, harvest trees from a forest and convert that timber into long-term carbon storage, facilities, whatever you want to call it. So, for example, you can cut down trees and you can bury the wood in an anoxic environment, and that wood is going to stay, keep its carbon, undecayed for potentially thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. You can also convert wood into biochar, which is very difficult for it to degrade, and this is a long-term store of carbon. So all of these project types, inherently, they're often more justified than, making the case that you're preserving trees. Not that these projects aren't justified, but, you get into these kind of sticky issues if you're talking about preserving trees in a park. So let's talk about baselines. This is the scenario that I described before of asking what would have happened if not for the project. And it's never really as simple as saying, like, all the trees would have been cut down. We really have to say how much of the trees would have been cut down. How many of the trees would have been replanted? The scenario often describes either the losses or gains that are likely to occur inside the project if no action is taken at all. One of the most common ways that people create these baselines is by creating a reference region. So you have a project area in which you're planting or preserving trees. You need some sort of analog for what would have taken place. The natural thing to do is to create kind of a geographic analog that's kind of similar to your project and see what happens there. So let's talk about the good and the bad for baselines. Avoided deforestation projects have typically gotten some of the most flack around their baselines. And a lot of the drama that you've seen about, like, carbon credits not being any good, it has to do with their baselines being manipulated. So, one of the things that we have to look out for when we're looking at carbon baselines, especially for avoided deforestation, is their reference region a reasonable analog for the project? Is it taking place in an area that's facing similar pressures, in the same forest type, with the same accessibility as the project? These are two examples on the top. On the right hand, we have a bad example in which a reference region is 650 kilometers away from the project in a completely different environment, a completely different forest type, and in no way analogous to what the forest in the project was actually facing. And on the left, we have a good example of a reference region that's just the watershed that surrounds the project. The surrounding watershed is a pretty good analog in this case for what likely would have happened inside the project because it's facing pretty much the same pressures as the project itself. The other thing that we have to watch out for is the modeling itself. So you have this reference region that says how much deforestation was taking place. Then you kind of have to plug that into some sort of predictive model to say what would have happened. Good predictive models are retroactive. Another way of saying that is dynamic. So dynamic baselines are a term that's out there. And the way that these work is that as the project progresses through time, you're basically just comparing to what happened outside the project. So you've got your reference region ahead of time. After 5 years of the project's existence, you look and you say, oh, well, 30% of the reference region was deforested. Therefore, 30% of the project would have been. Bad examples of baseline models are these predictive models that are trying to forecast the future, and particularly these predictive models that are forecasting more deforestation in the future than what's happened in the past. And so this is an example of a model that exists in a project today that's kind of infamous at this point, in which they took a deforestation rate of like a couple percent, like 2 or 3%, and they put this on this big exponential curve, and they said that 96% of the project was going to be cut down based on this 2 or 3% that they'd observed in the past. So model forms that are exponential, or in general just like predict more deforestation is going to occur, that's inherently not a reasonable and conservative way to be issuing carbon credits. Reforestation itself also needs baselines. So if you're planting trees, we have to take into account the fact that maybe trees would have grown back anyway. A lot of reforestation projects are maybe taking place on places that are marginal farmland, are now kind of being converted into forest naturally. So you can create baselines for reforestation as well to say that maybe 10% of the trees that are being planted would have grown back on their own. Another example of reforestation needing a baseline are these industrial plantations. So when we see industrial eucalyptus or teak or pine plantations being enrolled for carbon offsets, what we have to ask ourselves is this something that was happening otherwise commonly on the landscape? In this case, what we have here is a project that's kind of outlined in white. I know you can't really see it that well. And in blue, all of these areas around that project are other eucalyptus plantations that have been planted without carbon credits. So the idea that carbon credits were needed in order to plant the trees in this white area is kind of absurd, because people are planting trees anyway for timber on the landscape, and we don't need to incentivize more tree planting. So baselines are important for every type of project, even to some extent maybe renewable energy projects. Leakage is this other concept that is a little bit more nebulous. It's this idea that maybe the project's activities has caused emissions to occur somewhere else. And as you can imagine, this is very difficult to actually determine. It's in direct conflict with additionality, for one thing. So, for example, if you're preserving a forest and you know for certain that the guy next door to your preserved forest cut his trees down because of your project, then what you've actually done is prove that you've conserved a tree that was going to be cut down. So it's very difficult to actually, it's kind of like chasing your tail in some way, trying to measure leakage. The way that leakage is often measured with forestry projects is to basically put a buffer around the area that you're protecting and see if deforestation goes up inside that buffer. And if it does, then maybe that's an indicator that people are increasingly going next door because they're not able to cut down the trees inside the project. Leakage can occur in all project types, once again. So in reforestation, we have to watch out for leakage if we're taking pasture land or agricultural land away from farmers and planting trees on it. So if land was being used for cattle production and now trees are being planted, maybe that has just caused an incentive to deforest land next door and use that for cattle production. Some good examples of, reforestation dealing with leakage is when reforestation happens on otherwise unused land. So agroforestry is a good example. I mean, that's used land, but it's land that's now got a mixed use. Mangrove restoration is land that's often unused, and these tidal flats were not necessarily being used for anything. And then the best thing you can do for reforestation to combat leakage is to adequately compensate farmers for the losses that they may be taking by planting trees instead of growing crops. Leakage is another big problem with renewable energy credits. And the reason that this is the case is that it's hard to prove that by building a wind farm or a hydropower dam or something, you haven't just put more electricity on the marketplace and made electricity cheaper. And if you make electricity cheaper, then people are just going to use more of it, probably to mine Bitcoin or something like that. And then all you've done is kind of incentivize people to continue to use coal power as well as the renewable energy power that you created. Good examples with renewable energy credits is when you can directly tie the replacement of fossil fuels to the activity of the project. So I'm building this wind farm, and it's replacing a fossil fuel coal plant that exists on the electric grid today. I would say the hardest project type to deal with leakage is improved forest management. And it gets very challenging and a little philosophical. And the reason for that is that by conserving forests that were traditionally used for timber, we're taking lumber off the market. Now, lumber is used to build houses. And houses, you know, they're going to get built no matter what. So if the lumber is being taken off the market, then what we're doing is we're driving up the price of lumber on the market, and we're encouraging people to build houses out of other stuff, like concrete or steel. Unfortunately, every other construction material other than timber is really bad for the environment. Concrete alone represents 8% of all human emissions on Earth. And steel itself is also pretty bad for the environment, you know, per ton. So wood is the only sustainable building material that human beings really have access to. And by removing wood from the marketplace, what you're kind of doing is incentivizing people to build stuff out of worse things and creating emissions that way. So it kind of becomes pretty hard to justify protecting forests instead of using them for timber production, if you're thinking about it like this. You can see how, you know, you have to get really deep into the economics of the thing in order to say for certain that you're removing carbon from the atmosphere and not just encouraging people to build things out of cinder blocks. Next, I want to talk about verification. And the question that's being asked here is just how much carbon is actually being removed. You know, this is handled in different ways by different project types, obviously. To be clear, we have the capacity to measure how much carbon is being removed by pretty much every project type out there. So, you know, we have the capacity to measure trees pretty accurately, and we know pretty well how much carbon is being stored in trees. You know, there's some error bars around that, but we can all be pretty certain if we follow scientifically sound sampling techniques and use equations that have been developed by forest scientists. What you have to watch out for is that some carbon projects on the market don't do that. Some carbon projects on the market just use regional averages. So that's not a very good idea, especially if your forest happens to have less carbon in it than the regional average. Some forest carbon projects don't measure their trees, and some use their own equations. So you have to kind of read into the actual methodologies to understand whether or not you're supporting a project that has properly measured their trees or hasn't. Other project types, it's pretty straightforward for. For these, you know, project types that involve like wood burial and biochar, that's just a matter of measuring with a scale, you know, just weighing the wood. In terms of direct air capture, methane capture, it's very easy just to say, like, this is how much carbon is removed from the atmosphere. It's really just a meter that's sitting there spinning as methane is removed from the landfill. So, yeah, that's verification. Permanence is the next thing that we have to talk about. And what we're asking here is, for how long will the carbon really be removed from the atmosphere? There's a couple things to take into consideration here. I think the first thing that we have to consider is, what are the natural risks to this project? So is there risk of fire, insect outbreak, wind damage, flooding? What are the human risks? All of these things should be quantified adequately. And so, you know, we have the capacity to quantify what the annual burn probability is for a project. And ideally, we should be, you know, using a responsible insurance mechanism and, you know, basically setting aside credits for that insurance mechanism to make sure that if a forest does burn, it can be adequately compensated. So most of these risks can be quantified long-term, and the question is whether or not the carbon markets are doing a good job of that right now. To some extent they are, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of quantifying risk on the carbon markets. The other big question that we have to ask is, how long is the carbon going to be stored, even aside from the idea of like the trees burning down? So, you know, the first question is, how long is the project itself? You know, projects, they have a contract. The contract length can vary from, you know, 10 years to 100 years. You know, those two are not equal. There are some carbon protocols, some methodologies that make you, you know, protect your forest for 100 years, and there are others that are much shorter. Um, the other question is, how long is the carbon really going to be stored? So if we're talking about, some sort of like enhanced rock weathering, or if we're talking about some other weird project type, how long is that going to stay out of the atmosphere? In the case of a lot of these engineered solutions, it's usually, 10,000 years or more. In the case of trees, it's probably the length of the contract. Now, the thing that we have to consider here, apart from like how long the actual project is that as climate scientists, we are able to basically say mathematically how removing carbon from the atmosphere for a fixed short duration of time affects the atmosphere over a longer period of time. So we can mathematically compute the value of keeping carbon out of the atmosphere by protecting trees for 30 years. And we can use some I don't know, some basic, I guess it's calculus, to say, by protecting a forest for 30 years, this is the value over a 100-year period. This approach is called ton-year accounting. It's not used too much in the carbon markets. And the reason for that is that, some people went out there and they kind of abused this math. They started handing out credits that were 1-year credits, and they were kind of known as the hold your breath credits, because someone said, you might as well be holding your breath for 60 seconds and then issuing carbon credits for that. And, if the math is abused, then it gets a little bit dicier in terms of whether or not these credits are any good. But if you're talking about computing, the 100 or even 10,000 year value of a 40-year carbon project, that is something that we can do mathematically and scientifically. It's just up to society as to whether or not we want to accept that idea. So that's permanence. Next, we have to talk about ecological co-benefits. Now, obviously, this mostly refers to nature-based projects, forest conservation, wetland restoration. Biodiversity is an important component of ecological co-benefits. Many carbon projects are taking place in some of the world's least studied ecosystems. So, a lot of ecosystems, a lot of REDD+ projects are taking place in places where we're constantly still discovering new species. This is a new species of agama, I don't know what that is, that was recently discovered in a REDD+ project. Forest conservation projects in general are taking place oftentimes in the global south, and they're protecting some of the most important forests that we have in terms of biodiversity. This is another example. The Rimbaraya project consists of about a third of the last remaining habitat for this particular subspecies of orangutan. I mean, if this subspecies goes extinct, then, well, I mean, that's really bad for the orangutans, but scientists themselves are going to lose, like, the closest analog that we have to human beings. The other thing that we have to consider, aside from the fluffiness of preserving colorful lizards, is the human benefit of preserving forests. So forests filter water, they provide food and medicine, they provide recreation, they provide ecological resistance to like natural disasters, such as like buffering against floods. They provide reproductive sites for many of our most important food sources. Fish, for example, a huge proportion of the world's fish reproduce in mangrove habitats. They offer essential erosion control and topsoil accumulation. They improve air quality, they regulate temperature, they increase rainfall. If we were to cut down all of the Amazon rainforest, all of Brazil would turn into one giant savanna. It wouldn't be a pretty place. And they're often sources of pollinators. So, we all rely on agriculture for our food sources. A lot of times that agriculture is pollinated by animals that live inside the forest. This is just an example of a co-benefit that, we tracked down. This was a mangrove restoration project that was taking place in Pakistan. We figured out that after the successful planting of a lot of these mangroves, fish catch populations had gone up. Now, the project didn't even know that. It wasn't even aware that this was taking place. But it makes a lot of sense because all of the fish that they're catching were reliant on mangroves to reproduce, and before the project existed, all the mangroves have been cut down. The other thing to think about in terms of ecological co-benefits is that a lot of people these days are starting to turn to things called biodiversity credits. And, one of the reasons that they're starting to turn to this is that the carbon markets themselves have collapsed due to scandal. So, A lot of people have recognized that like a lot of the carbon credits on the market are nonsense. And so they're starting to kind of turn their attention to biodiversity credits, with the idea being that maybe we can just like focus on the ecosystem benefits of forests instead of talking about the carbon. I myself am a little worried about this idea. One of the reasons that I'm worried is that, I'm not sure that biodiversity can really be quantified and traded. And I'm really worried about a project or a company offsetting their biodiversity problems by buying and protecting a forest on the other side of the planet. I'm not sure it's fair to say that, my supply chain has deforestation in the Amazon and therefore I'm going to protect a forest in Papua New Guinea. I don't know how you can possibly equalize those two. More importantly, one of the biggest reasons that I'm concerned about biodiversity credits right now is that the groups that are developing these crediting systems are the same ones that have like historically developed carbon credits. And when I say the same ones, I'm mostly talking about Verra. Like I said, we've got a monopoly here. I don't really trust Verra to issue carbon credits very well. They have a pretty bad track record of doing that. And so I'm not really sure why I should trust them with biodiversity carbon credits either. We will see. There aren't any biodiversity credits on the market today, but there's sure a lot of money being thrown around to make it happen. The last key element to carbon projects is the social co-benefits. Now, I hate the term co-benefit because it implies that this is not a necessary component of, forest carbon. Really what this is asking is, are people being compensated properly for, their sacrifices? Carbon projects require people to give up their natural resources. They require people to give up their timber rights or their agricultural rights. They have to be compensated adequately, but oftentimes they're not. And this has driven some of the largest scandals in the industry. The best type of compensation that can exist is direct cash payments to people living inside these projects in a very transparent way. And so the best carbon projects that I see are carbon projects in which they have like very clear Excel files that show exactly who was paid and exactly where they planted the trees, and it's all very traceable. Clearly defined infrastructure goals are also good. So, a project that says it's going to build this many schools, this many hospitals, this many water treatment plants, all of these things are good social co-benefits that we can quantify in a very meaningful way. I will say a lot of carbon projects out there claim that job training or employment in some way counts as a co-benefit, and it doesn't. Training people to earn income is in no sense of the term a co-benefit. You're taking away somebody's resource. The only thing that you can do for them that's justifiable in that context is pay them for that. And the idea that, you can somehow make them better at getting a job in some other field after you've deprived them of a job in a field that they were in before is nonsense. So what are some good and bad examples? One of the best examples I've seen is the TIST program, and this is a project that directly pays 180,000 families for planting trees. So, for 180,000 families, this program has massive Excel files that you can go in and you can see exactly where all the payments went. And it's very transparent, and it's remarkable what they've managed to accomplish. One of the worst projects on the market today is called the Kariba project. And, colloquially, sometimes this project is known for bees for carbon. And the reason that this is a scandal is that it's been kind of revealed that this project has earned well over $100 million in carbon credits, probably closer to $200 to $300 million. And it's likely that somewhere between $100,000 and $6 million was actually spent on the communities. Now, the reason there's such a range there is because they don't really tell you how much money they spent on the communities. They only publicly admit to $100,000 of spending. The primary community benefit of this project was teaching people how to plant, how to grow bees, or how to keep bees for honey. And the idea was that, we can give people beekeeping courses in exchange for their timber rights. This caused a massive scandal, and there's been, articles written in Bloomberg and the New Yorker magazine and whatnot. This is a project that took place in a deeply impoverished nation of Africa, in Zimbabwe, and the idea that beekeeping courses is in some way supposed to compensate them from $200 million of timber that was extracted from their land is absurd. So let's talk about how carbon credits are created. We've made it through our 7 pillars here. It's a costly and complicated multi-year process. And what I want to point out here are 4 different groups that play a role at some point in this whole process. The first group that I've kind of already talked about are the verification registries. So this includes Verra, Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, Gold Standard. And these are the groups that create the rule sets and actually issue the credits. So they create these long, 200-page documents that say, exactly how you can preserve your forest in order to get carbon credits. The voluntary carbon market is unregulated. So these organizations aren't, regulated by any supervising body that determines whether or not they're doing things good. Like I said, about 68.5% of the market is controlled by Verra at large, but when you leave the United States and talk about voluntary nature-based credits, 95% of the market is currently controlled by Verra. So there is a monopoly that exists today in the carbon markets that has, Verra is the one that has created a lot of the rules, and they are the ones that are responsible for almost every single one of the carbon projects that I pointed out here. The good ones and the bad ones. The next group that I want to talk about in this process are project developers. So we have registries creating a set of rules. Somebody has to actually create the project. Well, the rules are fiercely complicated. A landowner can't just enroll and say, I want to protect my 100 hectares. What they have to do is they have to put together a comprehensive project plan in a project description document that's usually 100 or 200 pages long. They have to do all the math, they have to do all the measurements, they have to, track down all the people and make sure that all the signatures are there. And so developing projects is a difficult task. And companies exist to create these projects. The project developer ends up receiving most of the credits themselves. So verification registries, they're usually issuing credits to project developers who then sell them and then usually provide landowners with money in exchange. So most of the credits are flowing through these project developers that exist today. The largest project developers out there are valued at over $1 billion. And I have to say, unfortunately, that the top 5 project developers in existence today are all based in the US and EU. And this will come up again, but it's important that it's worth noting that most of the carbon credits in existence today are not coming from forests in the US and EU. Most of them are coming from forests in the global south. And so the people who are actually getting the credits and creating the projects are paradoxically not in the same places where the credits are actually coming from. The next group that I want to talk about are verifiers. So we've got a registry creating the rules. We've got a project developer who now has put together a packet following the rules and then goes to the registry and says, I have this carbon project. Here's all the details. Give me some credits. What happens next is they have to hire a verifier. Verifiers check the project's numbers and they make sure that the project followed all the rules. An important thing to note is that the verifiers only check to make sure that the projects followed the registry's rule set, not to make sure that the project is doing things in an ethical way. So there is no rule that says you can't spend your money on billionaire mansions in Switzerland. There is no rule that says you can't rig your area so that it's only protecting the bits of forest that weren't really at risk. And so verifiers let these things pass because that's not their job. The other thing to note is that verifiers are hired by project developers. So project developers come to the registries with their project packet, and they also then hire a verifier to sign off on it and stamp it as approval. Registry bodies themselves, Verra, they don't do any actual checking of the projects. They don't have satellite imagery. They're not looking to see that the forest is really there. They're relying on this system that they've created in which project developers and verifiers are kind of doing all the numbers and all the checks. So The verifier signs off and says that the project follows all the rules, and Verra, or the registry, then issues the carbon credits to the project developer. Well, those carbon credits then need to be sold. And here we have kind of another layer that exists on top of this whole thing. Brokers play a large role in the marketplace, and what they do is they basically go and they find companies and convince them to do something about their emissions, and they resell carbon credits, usually for a markup of somewhere between 10 and 20%. Some brokers do a lot of work to determine whether or not the projects that they're selling are good. So the broker that I used to work for, Pachama, we would spend enormous amounts of energy to make sure that we were selling good credits. Other brokers just sell whatever credits they can get their hands on. In addition to brokers, there's a whole bunch of other third parties out there that kind of have tacked onto the system. And frankly, my company is one of them. My company and some of the other companies out there like Solvera, what we do is we offer ratings. So we evaluate carbon projects as a true third party to make sure that all the numbers are correct. Now, you would think that that's what the verifier is for, but as we already said, the verifier is there just to make sure the rules are followed, and they're hired by the project developer, so they're really not a third party at all. So this is a long and complicated process that often takes 2 years or more. And throughout this entire process, it's not uncommon for somewhere between 50 to 90% of the carbon credits to be sucked up by all these middlemen. And so what makes it to the ground may be, less than 10% of the value of the actual carbon credit in the end, and it's very unfortunate. The other thing to note here is that because there's so many middlemen, only large projects work. So, if I were to own like 100 hectares of forest in Brazil, I really couldn't get carbon credits for it. It would need to be 50,000 hectares for anyone to really bother with this. So it's a difficult system. The system has a lot of flaws. There's a reason that I'm able to point to so many bad projects in this presentation. One of the most important flaws here is that every organization in this chain makes money by issuing credits. Verra makes money by issuing carbon credits. Project developers make money by getting carbon credits. Verifiers get paid by project developers, and hence they get money from carbon credits. And brokers get money from selling carbon credits. So there is an incentive everywhere along the chain to kind of rig the numbers and get too many carbon credits. The other another big problem is that there's no regulation whatsoever. So there's no government that says, like, this is how you have to do things. Even the compliance markets, like the California Air Resource Board, they don't do a very good job of actually regulating their forest carbon projects. Another big problem is that Verra maintains a monopoly over the world's carbon credits, and they have a very tight grasp on the carbon markets today. And so we would like to see a lot of competitors crop up in the space and do a better job, but there just hasn't been an ability to do so because companies primarily want to buy credits from the one and only registry Verra. And I think the biggest problem is that the system is so complicated that only insiders can really operate it. So, there's no situation when a landowner can kind of cut out all the middlemen, because you need to put together like a 300-page document sometimes in order to kind of show all the little detailed bureaucratic aspects that you have to show in this process. Ironically, even though there's 300 pages of bureaucracy, it doesn't seem to help the quality at all. More flaws in the system. Insurance mechanisms are very poorly constructed. So the way insurance is primarily handled today is that registries maintain buffer pools. So something like 10 to 20% of carbon credits are usually reserved and set aside. And if something goes wrong, carbon registries are supposed to take carbon credits out of that buffer pool to kind of compensate for the loss of a forest, for example. Well, one of the biggest problems today is that forest reporting, or loss reporting, it's voluntary. So there's nobody really looking to make sure that these projects are still intact. And it's resulted in a bunch of projects that exist on Verra's platform with forests that have long since been cut down. there's rules in place that say you have to check every 5 years, but those rules are flagrantly ignored. Numerous holes exist in the rule sets to allow all kinds of malfeasance. Everything from gerrymandering to rigging your baseline. Oftentimes registry bodies, well, Verra, will often say, like, this is difficult to get right. But honestly, there are very high quality rule sets out there. They're just very boutique credits. Project developers create their own numbers. This is a real problem. So, like I said, a project developer puts together the project and then hands that document to Verra and the verifier to certify. That means that the project developer is the one responsible for measuring the trees, for measuring the baseline, for predicting the leakage, all this stuff. That's a huge conflict of interest, and it's resulted in way too many credits being issued. Another big problem is that there's almost no transparency on the market. Now, all these people talk about how they love transparency, and yet if you actually want to see where these projects are taking place or see the math behind them, it's very difficult to do so. You'll get your 300-page document, but nowhere in that 300-page document will it actually say the trees were planted at this latitude and longitude. So transparency is a huge problem in terms of the numbers around the carbon, in terms of the budgets, where the money is going, and in terms of the inner workings of how the projects are set up. The other big problem that exists today is that a majority of credits today are traded in business-to-business transactions. So there's very few open marketplaces where, bids and asks can be placed for carbon credits. And this has resulted in kind of a system where the project developers who have all the keys to the credits, they have a little bit too much control over the marketplace. And so that's kind of resulted in, some not so great lack of transparency around pricing and around project quality that wouldn't exist if there was an open market. So, it's time to talk about the scandals, because unless you've been living under a rock, the carbon industry has been rocked by scandal over the last 12 months. There's been a couple of major scandals that have come out. One of the biggest ones came from a Science article in which a group of scientists, ran some numbers on Verra carbon projects and came to the conclusion that 94% of Verra carbon credits were invalid, or at least the ones from forests. Now, my own work indicates that that number is probably closer to 75%, but these numbers are grim. It indicates that potentially, many more carbon credits have been issued than has actually, CO2 has actually been removed from the atmosphere. So the reason behind this has mostly to do with the baselines. People were way exaggerating the risk of these forests. One of the biggest implications is that, carbon crediting itself may have led to more pollution going into the atmosphere because, big companies have pledged to do something about their emissions, and they would have to do something real, but, they have this option to buy credits that are maybe only 25% effective. And by giving them this option, or by making this system, so flawed as it is today, what we've really done is prevented real climate action from occurring. Another big article came out recently about the California Air Resource Board compliance market. That combined with another study from 2021 indicated that maybe around 30% of the California Air Resource Board compliance market credits were invalid. Similar types of reasons. The forest wasn't really at risk, problems with the methodologies. And then major journalist investigatory pieces have come out that have highlighted enormous injustices inside these projects. Human rights violations, violence. It's a bad situation, and we have to talk about it. I mean, it would be irresponsible not to. So I'm going to talk about 4 of some of the worst that I've come across. So let's go counterclockwise from the top right. The top right is the world's largest REDD+ project, Kariba. It's based on avoiding deforestation in Zimbabwe. It's the one that I talked about before about, bees for carbon. Many articles have been written about this project. The project probably received something like $200 million in money for their carbon credits. Timber and land rights were taken away from people in impoverished Africa, and in exchange, they were given beekeeping courses and community gardening courses. It's estimated that maybe 100,000 to maybe 2 million, maybe 6 million actually went to the ground out of $200 million. I want you to think what $200 million would do for rural Zimbabwe. It would do a lot of good. The developer of this project is based in Switzerland. Let's go one over to the left. Mai-Dombe is a carbon project in the Congo. Once again, this is a massive project, probably received about $100 million in carbon credits. 10 years later, a survey was done, with an unbiased group, a nonprofit group, the Rainforest Foundation, I think it was. They found that 96% of the people inside the project had no idea that they were entitled to any sort of benefits from the project and had never received a dime. The project itself, after 10 years, accounting for all of the work that it did on the ground and $100 million in carbon credits, had only distributed somewhere between 10 cents and 76 cents per person. Now, if you actually take the $100 million and you divide by the number of people inside the project, people would have been able to earn $1,000 a year in this rural Congo area. But that money went to a project developer based in San Francisco. The developer, during the course of this investigation, tried several times to get the reporters arrested. Take a look at the source. I encourage you to read all these sources. Bottom left, we have a project called South Cardamoms. It's a REDD+ project that is in Cambodia. The project developer hired Western mercenaries to patrol its land. The developer is once again based in San Francisco, so they needed to hire somebody to protect this forest. And there have been numerous cases of violence inside the project. There are many photos and videos online of these mercenaries going and burning down, indigenous people's buildings or burning their tractors or whatever it happens to be. The project has temporarily been suspended following a Human Rights Watch investigation inside the project. The last one I saved for last because I think it's the worst. This is a lawsuit that is going on in Papua New Guinea over a REDD+ project called Night Tapayo. Community members claim that they never gave consent for the project to take place on their land. And this is fairly believable because Night Tapayo is a project developer based in Mississippi in the United States, and the CEO of the Night Company is also the CEO of a U.S. mercenary group called Alpha Team 6. I'm not kidding here. Alpha Team 6 has been accused of flying around, with their ex-American mercenaries and getting, in their helicopters and getting people to sign contracts. The forest was severely deforested, and I think this is a key point here, which is that if you don't have people on the ground actually wanting to be a part of this project, if they feel as if they've been ripped off by this project, they're not going to stop cutting down the trees. So the project itself was a complete failure. It did receive a lot of credits despite that, but in 2023, the project was temporarily suspended. It's worth noting that in each of these cases, if the projects are suspended, they're only temporarily suspended. All of these credits for all of these projects are still on the marketplace. You can still buy them, you can still retire them, and trade them. Kariba credits, the top right, currently sell for $3.50 a ton. So there has not been any reconciliation or any mechanism to really fix this stuff, despite the scandal. Well, the scandal broke in January of 2023, and after the scandal broke, the value of carbon offsets plummeted. So it's dropped by something like 60% as of November of 2023. And, the unfortunate thing is that this has affected both good projects and bad projects. So let's harken back to the TIST program that really is paying 180,000 small farmers to plant trees all over Uganda, Kenya, and India. The number of trees that they've planted is literally visible from space by the naked eye. You can go on Google Earth and you can see Uganda is greener than it used to be, and that is because of this project. But, the scandals that have hit the carbon market because of this type of malfeasance, which is frankly colonialism, it's affecting even the good players too. And, I think one of the biggest problems is that carbon financing is incredibly difficult to begin with. My company estimates that, generally speaking, a fair average is that at least $30 a ton is needed for forest conservation or restoration. Now, carbon credits are selling for about $4 a ton right now on the voluntary market. And, if we really want to take into account all the land use alternatives, the idea that, they could have been making money off this land by harvesting timber or by growing cattle, then we're probably pushing up $50 to $75 a ton. So good projects are enormously expensive. Native reforestation takes 10 plus years to break even, and then it has to compete with all these land use alternatives of what they could have been doing with the land. There is no good financing mechanism to incentivize that 10-year window. So there really aren't no-cost loans for small farmers out there. They just don't exist today. So why would a small farmer plant trees for carbon credits if it's going to take 10 years for him to get his money? Direct air capture it's an example of a good project type, but it requires an enormous amount of renewable energy. So this is also extremely expensive. Preserving old growth rainforest. This is exactly what we should be doing. But, the value of the timber that could be gotten off that rainforest is at least $30 a ton, probably a lot more. So, carbon at the end of the day should be selling for $30 or more. And it was never selling for $30. It was at most selling for $15. But now it's selling for about $4. And, this leads to a spiral and kind of a crisis in quality. So the TIS program actually does sell carbon credits for $35 a ton, but it's a bit of a boutique. And it's only able to do so because it's reliant on charity, and it's also kind of, a particularly good project. Let's examine the spiral. We start at a place where carbon credits are not financially viable. They require $30 in order to be made to work. You can either supplement your income by harvesting timber, or you can supplement your income by using creative numbers. So you really want to protect this forest. How are you going to do it? Well, the only way you're going to be able to make it work financially is by rigging your baseline and getting more credits than you should. That is deeply unfortunate. What this results in is a quality crisis on the carbon market. People are not interested in buying your crappy credits anymore because you've rigged your baseline. What it also results in is way too many credits. So if my numbers are right and 3/4 of credits on the market today shouldn't exist, then that means that supply on the market is massively inflated. Can you imagine what credits would be selling for if we took 3/4 of the credits off the market right now? They'd probably be selling for $30 a ton. So credits end up selling for less. And now, the finances are even more grim. Credits need to be $30 a ton. You're only getting $3 a ton. Repeat the cycle. And so that's kind of the downward spiral that's existed in the carbon markets today. The scandals are widespread, and one of the biggest problems that exists today is that carbon offsets themselves are becoming a greater reputational risk than doing nothing at all. One of the biggest things that happened in the last year was that Delta Airlines was sued for buying bad offsets. And basically, the plaintiff in the lawsuit said that Delta claimed that its flights were carbon neutral. Its flights were carbon neutral. They increased the price of their tickets because of that. And this person says that they bought those tickets on that assumption that it was correct. To be clear, Delta was never carbon neutral. Delta purchased some of the cheapest carbon credits on the market, and they were, to this day, they're broadly thought of as illegitimate. Delta, it basically trusted these registry bodies, Verra mostly, but also, South Pole, the project developer, who issued the credits, and they never should have. They should have done more diligence. Now, all of this is kind of bad, but at the same time, is it really Delta's fault? I mean, how is Delta really supposed to know? It's important to note that the people who are not being sued in all of this are the airlines that have done nothing about their emissions, including United, for example. Sorry, United. The other people who are not being sued for all of this are the registry bodies and project developers. So Verra is the one who printed the credits that Delta used for their offsets. And South Pole is one of the project developers that created credits as well. And, they're not the ones facing a lawsuit right now. Delta is. So it sure looks to me as if Delta, they kind of tried to do something about their emissions, They didn't try anywhere near as hard as they should have, and now they're getting punished for it. And that's very dangerous because it creates a precedent where companies would rather do nothing at all than do something about their emissions. You know, they've kind of been scammed and they don't want to admit it. So Delta really doesn't want to admit the fact that they bought bad credits. It's all very unfortunate. So what has been the result of all this? Well, some of the biggest name companies out there have stopped buying carbon offsets. And you might think that's a good thing. They certainly act as if that's a good thing, but they are doing nothing about their emissions now. Bank of America, Nestle, Gucci, JetBlue, all of these companies were spending a lot of money on carbon offsets in 2021, and in 2023 they're spending nothing. And this is not a good thing at all. As I said, maybe like 75% of the credits that they bought are not genuine if they bought the market average. They were at least doing something about their emissions. They were doing maybe 25% about their emissions. So we face a really dangerous situation where people don't want to do anything about their emissions rather than buy offsets at this point. And it's not the fault of forests, and it's not the fault of offsetting in general. It's generally the fault of the registry bodies who have created these faulty offsets to begin with. So can the industry recover? There are some lights on the horizon. One of the biggest things that excites me is that there are numerous little competitors popping up to Verra. So in the last 12 months or so, we see a bunch of registries, including Open Forest Protocol, Isometric, Ecosystem Registry Standard, the Reykjavik Protocol, and Plan Vivo is older than 12 months, but they're fairly new to the scene. They've all popped up, and they're issuing carbon credits at a much higher quality standard than Verra. In a sense, the entire story of the carbon markets is one of an unregulated monopoly. Many include very common sense rules in their protocols. So many include the forbidding of timber harvesting of trees that are planted. Open Forest Protocol, for example, requires that 50% of the money from the carbon credits must go to the person on the ground. I have no idea why Verra doesn't require this. Many high quality projects, many of these are strictly sponsoring high quality projects. So the Ecosystem Restoration Standard only accepts native reforestation. Isometric only accepts removals of carbon dioxide that are permanent and long-term, like wood burial or biochar. So there is light on the horizon, and there are people who are giving this a shot at doing things right. But these things are only going to work if buyers really give it a fair chance. So we need buyers to give offsets another chance. We need Bank of America here to fire up their offset program again. And instead of buying Verra credits, buy credits from Isometric or Open Forest Protocol or Ecosystem Registry or all the other ones. We need buyers to be more diligent about their purchases. If you're spending $1 million on carbon credits, you can hire a consultant or a rating agency, like mine, to tell you whether or not the carbon credits are real. And we need, I think what we need is for people to accept players in the space who have less money and influence. And this is a real problem because the space right now is dictated by people who have the most power. It's dictated by these massive billion-dollar project developers and Verra. They go to these conferences that my little startup company can't even afford to send one person to. They're going to Davos in Switzerland. They're going to Green Biz that costs like $3,000 per ticket. And they're schmoozing and they're buying these carbon credits over a steak dinner rather than based on whether or not the science is real. And so what we need is a more impartial system where buyers are spending a little more time thinking about which credits they want to buy and not making purchases based on like the guy they met at a conference. There are other lights on the horizon. This is not the first carbon credit crash. Believe it or not, the same thing happened in 2008, 2009. That coincided obviously with the Great Recession. But one of the biggest reasons that it crashed in 2009 is that carbon credits in the first go-around, the first iteration of carbon crediting schemes, were really bad. They were really bad, carbon credits that were just being issued for anyone that planted a tree regardless of what they were doing. Ironically, Verra emerged from all of that as the solution to those. So we have the monopoly today that exists as a result of the carbon markets from the Clean Development Mechanism crashing in 2009. And now, after great malfeasance, the markets have crashed once again. The other light on the horizon is that there's a lot of integrity organizations that have popped up recently to kind of force carbon credits to do a better job. So there's IATA, there's the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, there's the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, CORSIA, ICROA, also known as the alphabet soup. And a lot of these guys are going out there and saying, okay, if you're going to be doing carbon credits, they have to, they have to be this good, and they have to be transparent, and they have to be, they have to have gotten like sign off from the people living in the project. And so there are a lot of these initiatives out there to improve the system. But these initiatives, they do also come with a downside, because IETSA, the VCMI, ICVCM, CORSIA, they all are very bureaucratic, large organizations. And the problem with that is that they're not very accepting of new ideas. So if some little registry crops up and says that I want to measure all my trees with LiDAR, I don't need to, I don't need to have a verifier come out and get paid by me to measure the trees. I can just do it with LiDAR and post that data publicly. These guys wouldn't accept that. They wouldn't accept new ways of doing tree measurement. They wouldn't accept new ways of doing leakage. They wouldn't accept, new ways of payment systems. They are very conservative in their approach. And generally speaking, they're kind of accepting of the system that's been in place already. And the real problem with that is that the groups that are not certified by these organizations are the little ones who are trying to have a big difference. So Open Forest Protocol, Ecosystem Restoration Standard, the Regen Network, Isometric City Forests, all of these great little teeny registries that have cropped up have not been able to get the stamp of approval of the ICVCM or CORSIA. But you know who has? Verra. Obviously these organizations, if they're going to be working with carbon credits, they're going to work with the largest player, the monopoly in the space, Verra. And so we have a situation here where even though these groups have popped up to kind of make the market have better standards, what they've really done is reinforce the monopoly. They've really made it so that no airline can ever buy carbon credits from Open Forest Protocol and count that against their CORSIA emissions. If you want to buy carbon credits, as an airline, you have to buy these Verra credits that are probably eucalyptus plantations. And so it's a very dangerous situation that we have right now, because on the one hand, we see a lot of people who are like doing really innovative and really good stuff for the market, but we see these kind of bureaucratic institutions that are in many ways linked to the old system, potentially holding people back. So we'll have to see. All of these are pretty new, especially VCMI, ICVCM, and it might be too early to really malign their work. And so we really have to give them a little bit more of a chance and see if they are willing to work more with these innovative groups that are doing things better than what has historically been done. There are more positive things to talk about. There are new ways emerging of thinking about carbon. Historically speaking, companies have thought about carbon as just being like a box they have to check. I have this many emissions this year, I have to buy this many credits, and then never think about it again. But really, we need to think about this as an accounting scheme. And so there's a new type of a carbon accounting coming out there called emissions liability management. And the idea here is that you're just keeping an accounting book of assets and liabilities. And so, your supply chain causes this many carbon liabilities, 10,000 tons of carbon. You have to buy some assets to make up for that. Well, if the asset falls through, if the asset is only a 10-year project, then after 10 years, you have to buy more. So we have to start thinking of carbon as being like a long-term liability that sits on accounting books forever and isn't just erased by the short-term purchase of a carbon credit. In thinking about this, maybe insurance against bad credits can start to be handled by purchasers and by insurance companies rather than by the carbon registries themselves. And maybe that will drive up the quality of carbon credits in general. Finally, there's a lot of new technology on the horizon that can really improve these carbon projects. Remote sensing can be used to measure trees without anywhere near as much human bias as has historically been the case. We can dramatically reduce the cost of enrollment. So My company, for example, over large portions of the United States, we're able to measure carbon just as accurately as a field inventory. And what that means is that small landowners can start to enroll in these carbon projects if they were to use this approach. We can really start to democratize the process. And if we were able to use remote sensing to democratize the process and make it so that all of the information was collected automatically, then we could get away from having these project developers that are rigging the numbers. A lot of carbon projects today are, using smartphone apps to measure the trees, or they're using smartphone apps for microfinance. And what this allows is for people inside these projects to get directly paid by the project. And that's the most important part for making sure these projects actually work out. So we've got innovative registries like the Open Forest Protocol allowing for, farmers to use their smartphones to sign up, trees that they've planted. We've got Treo2, for example, has an app to track every single tree that trees have been planted. And ultimately, what this all means is greater transparency, and it means the money will end up in the right place, and the conservation and restoration will actually get done. So that's all I've got for the carbon markets. A lot of doom and gloom, but honestly, they can be made to work. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways here is that, yeah, there's been a lot of malfeasance. And I mean, the industry in a real way has to be purged. But there's a lot of people who are doing really good work. And even if we take my grim number of 75% of carbon offsets aren't genuine, that still leaves us with 25% of carbon offsets that are. That adds up to hundreds of millions of tons of carbon that's been removed from the atmosphere successfully. And that's why I'm comfortable offsetting my own emissions, because I am able to do this diligence, and I am able to, see which projects are really putting in the effort. And I feel perfectly comfortable in the concept of offsetting my own emissions with carbon credits that are long-term and validated, and making sure the money is actually making it to the ground. So I hope you will too, and I hope that this market will see a resurgence and a bit of maybe a bit of a reconciling with what constitutes quality.